Um, okay, I want to talk about something we might disagree on because that's often interesting for people to listen to.
Okay, sure.
There's a chapter in there about intoxication,
Yeah.
and which we could talk about in general. But let's take this within the context of, again, a malleable ethics.
Yeah.
And here we are today, and we're in a crisis. And let's say you view this crisis at its core as a spiritual crisis, like people, not, as you said, looking for ethics, looking for something to stand on, and trying to find their navigation inside a world that's collapsing and transitioning.
Yeah.
For some people, psychedelic therapy is quite useful for them because it's a kind of illumination or cracks through a shell that is so thick for them, and it allows them to see something maybe they couldn't have seen otherwise.
Yeah.
And I think your position is more like taking the helicopter to the mountain is not as valuable as climbing the mountain,
Yeah.
which I
Yeah.
can understand. But what about, like, we're in a situation where we need change quickly, and not everyone can climb the mountain.
Yeah. I mean, I understand that argument, and I have to be careful what I say because um, the problem with endorsing any of that stuff is you don't know who's hearing your endorsement and you don't know where they're going to take it. So I've one of the reasons I moved recently is because I was dealing with a neighbor who constantly was abusing drugs, and he's not without his spiritual side, and I suspect maybe he got into it for those reasons at first, and now he's just kind of an addict who causes a lot of trouble. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so those substances, I think, can. This is where I'm almost afraid to say that they can be valuable, but I think they can in certain for certain people in certain times. But it's something that you have to be real careful with because they also um, there's one of the ways it's usually put when people translate the precept against using drugs into English is don't use drugs that cause heedlessness. I've had my own experiences with LSD and mushrooms and marijuana and things like that, and there is a spiritual dimension to it, but I also see that there's a certain recklessness that seems to come with it, and maybe it's similar in nature to the people who dive into a very intense meditation practice without any preparation for it.
Mm.
And so, you're kind of you're gonna be in this altered state of mind, and the altered state of mind will allow you to see things that your usual state of mind kind of masks or covers over. But at the same time, a lot of the filters are also gone. A lot of the things that keep you from doing stupid things, and just kind of going the wrong way, that can be, and also introducing something from the outside. There's a tradition in Buddhism, in Zen Buddhism, the kyosaku, which is a stick. And at a lot of Zen temples, when you're sitting, there's a guy who comes along observing your practice, and if he sees that you're kind of going wonky, he hits you with the stick. And the
It's very
stick can
zen.
be, yeah, and the stick can be very valuable, and a lot of people think it's a great tool for getting you back on track. And I was at a retreat where somebody was talking about this in the Q&A session at a lecture to my teacher, and going on and on very eloquently about the value of the stick. And my teacher said, well, yes, all of that is true, but I think it's more valuable to learn to wake up by yourself. so so I think that's kind of the bottom line. Any of these states that are accessible via drugs are also accessible via other means, because they wouldn't be accessible via drugs unless they were there already, unless it was already present. The drug doesn't make something happen. It just kind of, I think it kind of shuts down certain areas of the brain so that other areas become more accessible or more obvious. And that can be valuable if you never suspected those aspects of existence were there, which often a lot of people don't even suspect it. But again, you're also you're shutting down something that maybe is there for a good reason, and that's the problem with it.
Okay, but what if you could see this idea of the stick? It's a kind of training wheel in
Yeah,
Zen. Like, so hopefully the idea is, yeah, well, you need the stick to learn when you're getting off course, and then eventually you can do that yourself. And similarly, in psychedelic therapy, perhaps it's in a kind of illumination that's quite temporary. You have to come back to this reality,
yeah,
and as you said, for some folks, of course, it's more valuable to find these states in a more gradual way. But um, I think for a lot of people, we're so dominated by mind today that for the vast majority of people, the thought of sitting and zazen and doing years before even going to a meditation retreat for them today, they're just like, man, I'm struggling. Like, and I don't even know if there is more. There isn't more. I think about or the
yeah.
rationalist materialist type person.
Yeah, I don't know. I kind of think I can't completely deny that, but then again, I think about the 60s culture in which everybody got very excited about, LSD is going to free us all, and then it didn't, and then it went terribly wrong, and now, and I think there's a kind of a sense of trying to come back to that and get it right this time. And I wonder if we've collectively learned enough. We'll see whether, and there's nothing I can do to prevent it. It's just going to happen. But I think you got to be really cautious about that stuff because they can be so seductive and so attractive. And there is a certain kind of person who, once they get their hands on it, like my neighbor, um, that that's they're going to keep going to it again and again and
Yeah.
again, and it's just going to become this downward spiral that I don't know. I really worry about this guy if he'll ever get out of his downward spiral that the drugs have gotten him on. And I've seen that, town I went to college in and stayed in a lot after college, Kent, Ohio, was kind of full of those people. It's this kind of old hippie town. Um, Full of people who'd gone down that path for reasons that were probably noble at first, but then they kind of ended up stuck.
Well, self delusion is a danger, and you do need containers and support around this. You talked about preparation that's needed for a meditation retreat. I would completely agree for any type of mind expanding experience. It's like you need to have something to stand on, a kind of
Yeah.
practice to work with and support. I mean, do you think it's possible that people can have similar delusional states that can happen through perhaps meditation, or they get off course if they don't have a teacher?
Oh yeah, you can. Yeah, I mean that's part of the dangers of meditation. That's one of the reasons for having a teacher and having a good teacher, which is often another step to take, which is difficult. But you can, and it's happened. There's a story. I don't know if I've put this in more than one of my books, and I'm not sure if it's in The Other Side of Nothing. I know it's in a book called Sit Down and Shut Up. But there was the the incident in Japan. I think it was 1994, when I was living in Japan, where this guy who was a leader of a religious cult put sarin gas on the Tokyo subway systems, and several, I think 11 people died, and like hundreds were sickened, some of them for the rest of their life, by this nerve gas this guy had put on. And he was a cult leader, but he was also he'd also started very sincerely, but he'd gotten off course because he'd had a few experiences. The cult leader, what's his name? Asahara was his name, who had these experiences that were very profound, and he didn't have a teacher, and so he was kind of teaching based on his own experiences, which he'd, as an individual, turned into something weird. But there was a story I read in a paper, an English language Japanese newspaper called Yomiuri Shimbun, and It was about a Zen teacher who, after this gas attack happened, he ended up counseling a lot of former members of the cult. And so he read up on Asahara's experiences, and he noticed that they were very similar to the experiences that he, this Zen teacher, had had during his Zen training. But in his case, he'd had a teacher who, whenever he brought these experiences up to his teacher said, "Okay, yeah, you gotta stop that. You got to get back. You got to get back to your grounding in this world, and not go off into these wonderlands, which are often available to people who meditate and to people who use psychedelics too. Often it's easier to get there with psychedelics, frankly, than with meditation. But those wonderland experiences have a dark side, which is always there. It's like the front and back of the coin. I've got a guitar pick, but
Yeah.
the back side of the coin is always there, even if you're only looking at the front side. So the dark side is always there, even if you're only looking at the wonderland, beautiful side. So you kind of being aware of that is what grounding is all about.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, it's true. Like all these states are there. It's just us accessing them in different ways at different times and
Yeah.
knowing how to navigate them. Um, well, as we round this out, what do you think people get wrong about Zen or any
Oh God.
misconceptions, particularly like in the context of our situation now, in
Yeah,
modern
well, I
times?
mean, Zen is. I have an Instagram. I'm not plugging my Instagram, but one of the things I like to do on my Instagram is I just find Zen things. The Zen. My favorite is in West Hollywood. There's the Zen marijuana dispensary with this fat green Buddha as their emblem. So, this kind of points out the misconceptions of Zen, that it's this kind of a blissed out, chill out sort of state. And certainly blissing out and chilling out is part of the Zen experience. It's one of the most attractive parts of it. But there's a whole other side to it, which is integrated into the whole of life. So people who are initially, like I was interested in Zen because I wanted to find that blissed out, chilled out sort of thing
Yeah.
that was highly advertised. But there's a lot more to it than that. There's a whole the ethical talking about the ethical aspects of Zen. I thought, in terms of this new book, was a good way to get into the more holistic approach that Zen gets into, because a lot of people forget that. A lot of people want to get into the chill out stuff and they forget, well, there's a whole ethical, moral side to Zen, which often people don't want, and I see people who come to me sometimes who, once we get into that stuff, they're like, oh, I didn't think it was going to be, a religion. And actually don't think Zen really qualifies in the subset of religions, but there are certain aspects of it that are very much like a religion, and the ethics are part of that.
Yeah, the commonality. I mean, I think it's rooted in the idea of uh, lowering your suffering. Really,
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
it's more just like, look, this is what we've found works to have an easier life.
yeah. And that's a really important part of it. I mean, the ethics, when I first encountered them, I thought they were rules that had to be followed, in order to avoid punishment or something, by God or Buddha. But it's more like suggestions, strong suggestions, I would say, to have a better life.
Yeah, and I guess I said I'd circle back to the not killing one. I guess I should close that out. But um, this idea of not killing and it's sort of like ideas like telling the truth in a sense, and like what is truth, and it gets to like what is
Yeah,
killing,
yeah,
and is that even possible? And I thought that just was a really interesting discussion. It just reminded me of a story I might have mentioned on this podcast before, where I went to a talk of a Tibetan Buddhist in our little town in southern Utah. So they had brought him in, and he went on this long discussion about basically this subject. And there's a lot of ranchers out there. We all, a lot of cows and a lot of people hunt. And
yeah,
he's talking about eating meat. And he was just kind of saying, like, look, I mean, do what you want, but it is what it is, cause and
Yeah.
effect. And someone was really pushing back, and they went to this long thing about it. And then we all went to dinner, and he orders a steak. And and then I noticed as one more level of intrigue, he cut the steak in half and he gave half of it to a dog that was lurking around. And I thought that was like an insurance plan or something. But
Maybe.
yeah. So anyway, I just thought I'd throw that out there. And I don't know if you had anything you want to add about that
That's
chapter. I just thought it
it.
was an interesting, rich subject.
It is an interesting, and Tibetan Buddhists are kind of famous for eating meat. Both of my teachers, neither of my teachers were vegetarians, and I am, and that's kind of an issue that I struggled with. Both of my teachers thought it was better to be a vegetarian, but neither of them was, and I thought that was kind of interesting.
Right.
You know,
Well, I can understand that. Yeah.
yeah, my Japanese teacher was just like, it's force of habit. I've eaten meat all my life, so I'm not going to stop. And my American teacher had actually been told by a doctor that he shouldn't be a vegetarian because he had certain nutritional, deficiencies and stuff. So he didn't really like eating meat, but he did. And so, yeah, I don't think even the strictest vegan can get away from killing. Killing is going to happen, and
Yeah.
it's part of how, that's how life moves forward. Life moves forward by taking other lives, and you can't get away from that no matter how hard you try. But I do think there's some value in trying, which is why I'm still a vegetarian.
Mm.
So
Well, we'll leave it at that.
yeah.